An elderly man, believing his son is taking him to a nursing home, steps out of the car into an unfamiliar clearing. Confused and heartbroken, he braces himself for the worst. But what he sees next leaves him completely stunned. What did he see? Drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this warm your heart, hit subscribe for more inspiring tales. Victor Castillo sat on the edge of a twin bed in his grandson's former bedroom, his frail hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the worn cuffs of his sweater. The room around him was a time capsule, posters of rock bands from another decade hung crookedly on the walls. And trophies coated in a thin layer of dust stood proudly on a narrow shelf above a cluttered desk. Outside the window, the faint sounds of traffic filtered in from the suburban Austin street below. It was a world that felt both too big and too small for him. At 74, Victor carried the weight of 2 lifetimes, one filled with love and purpose alongside his late wife, Rosa, in their cozy San Antonio home, and another filled with silence and shadows in his adopted son Marco's house. Marco and his wife, Eliza, were good people, kind and patient, but Victor couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he was an imposition. Meals often arrived on a plastic tray carried by their bubbly neighbor, Carla, whose presence brought warmth into the sterile quiet of the house. Carla seemed to visit more often than necessary, and Victor couldn't help but wonder if her generosity extended beyond food and light conversation. Victor's mind frequently wandered back to San Antonio, to the modest home he and Rosa had poured their love into. The scent of her homemade tortillas, the sound of her soft humming as she tended to the garden, it all felt so close, yet so impossibly far. That house had been their sanctuary, a testament to years of shared struggle and triumph. But it was gone now, consumed by flames that reduced a lifetime of memories to ash and smoke. The fire had been swift and merciless. Victor had barely escaped, stumbling out into the street with nothing but the clothes on his back and the acrid taste of smoke in his lungs. He spent 24 long days in the hospital, each breath a painful reminder of what he had lost. But in the midst of that suffering, something strange happened. His medical bills, an impossible sum for a retired widower, were mysteriously paid off. Nurses murmured about an anonymous benefactor, but no one could or would tell him more. After his release, Marco had brought Victor to Austin. It was a kind gesture, but Victor knew it wasn't without its strain. Their home wasn't built for him, his room was borrowed, a temporary space carved out of a life already in motion. Victor often heard whispered conversations late at night, voices muffled by walls that were thin enough for regret to slip through. He couldn't make out the words, but he caught the weight in Marco's tone and the tired sighs from Eliza. They were struggling, and he was part of the reason why. One evening, as the setting sun painted golden streaks across the walls of his borrowed room, Victor overheard Marco and Eliza talking in the kitchen below. Their voices were low, but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the refrigerator. Carla said she'd help again this month, Marco said. Eliza's reply was softer, almost pleading. But for how much longer? We can't keep relying on her. Marco. Victor froze, his frail fingers curling tightly around the edge of a crocheted blanket Rosa had made years ago. Carla. Of course. The warmth and kindness in her smile suddenly carried a weight he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just bringing him meals, she was helping Marco and Eliza bear the financial burden of his care. The realization settled heavily in his chest. It was a feeling he had become too familiar with since losing Rosa, guilt. It was different from grief, sharper and more personal, like a splinter lodged deep in his heart. He had become a weight they had to carry, a responsibility that stretched their already thin resources. That night, Victor sat in the darkened room, clutching an old photograph of Rosa and himself on their wedding day. Her smile, captured forever in black and white, felt like a bomb and a dagger all at once. "I'm sorry, Rosa," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't mean to end up like this." Days passed, but the weight of guilt did not ease. Meals tasted like cardboard. Conversations felt like empty echoes. And the walls of his grandson's old room seemed to close in tighter each day. Victor began to entertain an idea, one he had dismissed many times before but now clung to like a lifeline. A nursing home. It was the only solution that made sense. Marco and Eliza would no longer have to worry about him, and Carla could return to her own life without shouldering their family's burdens. It wasn't a choice he wanted to make, but one he felt was necessary. Victor didn't bring it up immediately. He rehearsed the words over and over in his head, each syllable carving deeper lines into his weathered face. Finally, one morning, as the smell of coffee drifted up from the kitchen, he descended the stairs with a heaviness in his step. "Marco," he said, his voice trembling but resolute, "I think it's time we talk about me moving to a home." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Marco's face fell, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand. "Dad." "No," Marco said firmly. "We're fine. You don't have to." But Victor shook his head, silencing him with a look of quiet determination. "Please, son. Just think about it." Marco nodded slowly, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. Victor turned and climbed the stairs back to his room, his steps slow and deliberate. In the silence of his borrowed space, Victor sat down on the edge of the twin bed once more. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the walls. The room felt colder than ever. Victor Castillo awoke early on a Wednesday morning, the faint light of dawn spilling through the thin curtains of his grandson's former room. The house was still silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting the motion, and stared at the neatly packed suitcase by the door. It had taken him days to muster the courage to prepare it, each folded shirt and carefully packed photograph feeling like a farewell note. The idea of moving to a nursing home had rooted itself firmly in his mind. It wasn't a decision made lightly. But Victor couldn't shake the image of Marco and Eliza whispering in the kitchen, their voices heavy with unspoken worries. He had become a strain on their lives, a constant reminder of responsibilities they hadn't asked for. The thought gnawed at him day and night. Victor had done his research, or rather, as much research as an elderly man with shaky hands and limited internet skills could manage. With Carla's quiet help, he had contacted a local nursing home, Golden Pines Assisted Living. The woman on the phone had been polite, her voice smooth and reassuring, as she scheduled a tour for him the following week. Victor hadn't told Marco or Eliza. It was better this way, he reasoned. Better to leave quietly than to burden them with long, tearful goodbyes. At breakfast that morning, Marco chatted about work while Eliza sipped her coffee, occasionally glancing at Victor with a look he couldn't quite decipher. Victor pushed his scrambled eggs around his plate, his appetite lost somewhere in the heavy fog of his thoughts. "Dad, are you okay? You've been quiet lately," Marco said, his brows knitting together with concern. Victor forced a small smile. "Just tired, son. Didn't sleep well." Marco hesitated, but eventually nodded, returning to his coffee. Victor's heart ached at the sight of his son's worry, but he pushed the feeling down. Soon, he told himself, it would all be easier for them. The days crept by slowly, each one blending into the next. Victor spent hours staring out the window, watching the neighborhood kids play in the street and listening to the faint hum of lawnmowers in nearby yards. He thought often of Rosa, her laughter echoing faintly in his ears. Would she have supported his decision? Or would she have begged him to stay? On Friday evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Marco appeared at Victor's door with an unexpected announcement. Dad, pack your things. Tomorrow, we're taking a trip. Victor's heart froze mid-beat. A trip? Did Marco know about Golden Pines? Had he somehow discovered Victor's plans? Panic flared briefly in his chest before settling into quiet resignation. Perhaps this was Marco's way of sparing him the awkward conversation. Yes, of course, Victor said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco smiled faintly and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. The night stretched on endlessly as Victor sat beside his suitcase, his frail hands trembling as he clutched Rosa's photograph. By the time morning arrived, Victor was ready. Or at least, he tried to convince himself he was. He dressed carefully, buttoning up a freshly ironed shirt and smoothing his thinning hair back into place. As he picked up his suitcase, he paused by the window, taking in the soft morning light spilling across the quiet street. Rosa, he whispered, his voice trembling. I hope I'm doing the right thing. Downstairs, Marco and Eliza waited by the car, their smiles warm but carrying an undercurrent of something Victor couldn't quite name. He climbed into the back seat, clutching his suitcase tightly against his chest as the car pulled away from the curb. The road stretched out before them, winding and endless. As Victor stared out the window, the sun rose higher in the sky, but the knot in his stomach remained, tight and unyielding. The trip had begun, and with it, Victor braced himself for whatever lay at the end of the road. The hum of the car engine filled the silence as Victor Castillo sat in the back seat, clutching his small suitcase tightly against his chest. Marco drove steadily, his hands firm on the steering wheel, while Eliza sat in the passenger seat, occasionally turning back to offer Victor a soft smile. The morning sun spilled golden light across the road, but Victor felt none of its warmth. The scenery outside the window gradually changed. Suburban neighborhoods gave way to sprawling fields, then winding country roads flanked by tall trees that cast long shadows over the asphalt. Victor stared out at the passing world, his mind drifting to memories of San Antonio. He could almost see Rosa sitting beside him on their porch, sipping coffee as the sun set over their little home. The ache in his chest tightened. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The air in the car felt heavy, every breath an effort. Where are we going? Marco, he asked, his voice barely rising above the noise of the tires against the pavement. Marco glanced at him briefly in the rearview mirror. Don't worry, Dad. It's a surprise. You'll see when we get there. A surprise. The words did little to ease Victor's growing anxiety. His mind returned to the nursing home he had contacted, Golden Pines. Was this Marco's way of taking him there without an argument? Was this trip just a long, winding road to a place where he would be left behind? Eliza turned around and offered a reassuring smile. You'll like it, Victor. Trust us. But trust was difficult when uncertainty clouded every mile they passed. The road grew narrower, the pavement turning into gravel. The car rattled slightly as Marco maneuvered around potholes and uneven ground. Victor's knuckles turned white as he tightened his grip on the handle of his suitcase. His breath quickened. Marco, Victor said again, this time firmer. though his voice wavered. "Please, just tell me where we're going." Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowed the car as they approached a clearing. The tires crunched over gravel, and the car came to a gentle stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Victor hesitated before opening the car door. His old legs felt stiff as he stepped out onto the uneven ground, the gravel shifting under his shoes. He looked around, his heart sinking. Before him stood a construction site. Wooden beams jutted into the sky like skeletal remains, and piles of lumber and construction equipment lay scattered across the dirt. Dust swirled in the warm breeze, carrying with it the faint smell of fresh paint and sawdust. Victor's chest tightened as he took in the unfinished structure. The exposed framework of the building, the raw edges of the wood, it all felt cold, incomplete, and unwelcoming. "Is this where they're leaving me?" he thought, his stomach knotting painfully. His suitcase slipped from his fingers, hitting the gravel with a muted thud. Marco was by his side in an instant, placing a steady hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad," Marco said softly, his voice calm and steady. "It's not what you think." But Victor wasn't listening. His mind raced with thoughts of abandonment, of loneliness, of being left in an unfamiliar place with strangers. His breathing grew shallow, and for a brief moment, the world tilted on its axis. Eliza approached slowly, her expression gentle and her voice soothing. "Victor, please, just come with us. Let us show you something." Victor's eyes stung with unshed tears as he allowed Marco to guide him forward. Each step felt heavy, like walking through quicksand. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty shell of the building as they rounded a corner. And then, Victor froze. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. In front of him, beyond the exposed beams and scattered tools, stood a fully completed side of the house. The paint was fresh. The windows gleamed in the sunlight. And the porch, the porch looked exactly as he remembered it. Victor's trembling hand rose to his mouth, a choked sob escaping his throat. He could barely form the words, his voice breaking under the weight of emotion. What is this?" Marco squeezed his shoulder gently. "It's home, Dad. We rebuilt it for you." Tears spilled freely down Victor's cheeks as he looked from Marco to Eliza, and then back to the house. The knot of fear and anxiety in his chest slowly began to unravel, replaced by a warm, overwhelming flood of love and gratitude. For a long moment, Victor simply stood there, staring at the home that had been torn from him by fire and now, against all odds, had been given back to him by love. In the distance, a soft breeze stirred the trees, and for the first time in months, Victor allowed himself to hope. Victor Castillo stood frozen in place, his frail body trembling as he took in the sight before him. Beyond the skeletal beams and construction dust stood a fully finished section of a house, his house. The porch railings gleamed with fresh white paint. The familiar teal shutters framed the windows just as Rosa had always loved them. And the wooden front door stood open, inviting him inside. His breath hitched as emotions swelled in his chest. A flood of disbelief, confusion, and overwhelming gratitude threatening to consume him. Marco stepped beside him, his voice gentle yet steady. "It's your home, Dad," Marco said softly. "We rebuilt it. For you." Victor's lips quivered, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Eliza joined them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We know how much San Antonio and this house meant to you," she said. "We wanted to bring it back, to bring you back." Victor's trembling hand reached out, his fingertips brushing against the smooth wood of the porch railing. It was solid. Real, more real than he could have ever imagined. His voice cracked as he spoke. "But how? How did you do this?" Marco smiled faintly. "It wasn't just us, Dad. The people from the old neighborhood, the ones you helped over the years, they came together. They offered time, resources, money, everything they could to help rebuild this house. They wanted to give something back to you." Victor's knees buckled slightly, and Marco quickly stepped forward, steadying him by the arm. "Come on, Dad," Marco said softly. "Let's take a look inside." Step by step, Victor climbed the familiar porch stairs, his shoes tapping softly against the wood. Each step felt like walking back in time, as if Rosa might appear in the doorway with her warm smile and a plate of homemade cookies. His chest ached with longing. The front door creaked slightly as Marco pushed it open, revealing the interior. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, illuminating the living room. Victor's eyes swept across the space. There was the same old rocking chair near the window, the framed family photographs on the mantel, and Rosa's favorite floral curtains hanging lightly in the breeze. Victor reached out and touched the armrest of the rocking chair, his voice breaking. This is exactly how it was. Every detail, it's the same." Marco nodded. "We salvaged what we could from the fire. And for everything else, we used photos, your stories, and help from the neighbors to recreate it as closely as possible." Victor's eyes welled with tears as he turned to face his son. I thought you were leaving me behind. I thought this trip was." Marco's brow furrowed, and he shook his head firmly. "No, Dad. Never. We wanted to give you back what you lost. We wanted you to have a place where you felt at home again." Eliza stepped forward, holding a leather-bound photo album. "We also found something during the rebuild. You should see this." Victor took the album with trembling hands and opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, some singed at the edges but still intact. Pictures of Rosa smiling in the garden, of Marco as a boy helping Victor fix a fence, of warm summer evenings on the porch. Each image was a fragment of a life Victor had believed was lost forever. His shoulders shook as he clutched the album to his chest. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of gratitude. "Thank you both, for everything." Outside, the soft breeze carried the faint scent of fresh paint and blooming flowers. For the first time in years, Victor felt anchored, not by guilt or grief, but by love, resilience, and the promise of home. Marco placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. "Take your time, Dad. This is your home. You're exactly where you're meant to be." Victor nodded, his eyes glistening as he turned back to the living room. For a moment, he could almost hear Rosa's laughter echoing softly through the halls. He closed his eyes and let the warmth of the moment wash over him. He was home again. Victor Castillo stood in the center of the living room, clutching the leather-bound photo album to his chest. The weight of the memories within it felt heavier than the book itself. Around him, the familiar scent of wood polish and faint traces of Rosa's favorite lavender air freshener filled the space, pulling him deeper into the past. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every tiny detail seemed to whisper her name. Marco and Eliza watched him silently, giving him space to process it all. After a few long moments, Marco spoke softly. "Dad, there's something else we want to show you." Victor turned, his tired eyes meeting his son's. Marco gestured toward the front door, and with hesitant steps, Victor followed them outside. The late afternoon sun cast golden hues across the freshly painted porch as a gentle breeze rustled the nearby trees. And then Victor heard it, a sound so familiar it made his breath catch in his throat. A whinny. His head turned sharply towards the small paddock just beyond the house. And there, standing under the shade of an old oak tree, was Palomo. The chestnut-colored horse raised his head, ears twitching forward as if he recognized Victor instantly. "Palomo," Victor whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. The horse took a few cautious steps forward. And Victor, without thinking, shuffled down the porch steps toward him. His old knees protested with every step, but he didn't stop until his trembling hand was resting on Palomo's soft muzzle. The horse huffed gently, nuzzling against Victor's palm. How is this possible?" Victor asked, turning back to Marco and Eliza, tears glistening in his eyes. Marco smiled. He was saved. "Dad." A neighbor recognized him during the chaos of the fire and managed to get him out safely. He's been staying with one of the families nearby all this time. When we started rebuilding, they brought him back. Victor's chest heaved as he let out a broken laugh, his forehead resting against Palomo's head. The bond between man and horse was unbroken, surviving both fire and time. After a while, Marco gently guided Victor back toward the house, leaving Palomo grazing peacefully under the tree. Inside, Eliza was waiting with 2 cups of tea and the photo album still resting on the coffee table. Victor sank into his favorite armchair, now beautifully restored, and opened the album once again. The photographs told stories of laughter, hard work, and simple joys. A younger version of himself smiled back from faded prints, arm in arm with Rosa, while Marco played happily in the background. As Victor turned the final page, he noticed a handwritten note tucked into the back cover. It was Rosa's handwriting. "No matter where we are, as long as we carry love in our hearts, we will always be home." Victor's voice trembled as he read the words aloud, his fingers tracing the familiar script. Marco's voice was gentle. "We found that in a box of things that somehow survived the fire. Mom always knew how to leave the right words behind." Victor nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He leaned back into the chair, the weight of the photo album resting on his lap. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, and the sounds of Palomo's gentle grazing drifted in through the open window. For the first time in years, Victor felt whole. The emptiness that had hollowed out his heart since the fire was slowly being filled, not just with memories, but with the undeniable proof of love and resilience. His home, his horse, his family, it was all here. Victor closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the evening light wash over him. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The evening settled softly over the house, the sky painted in hues of deep orange and violet. Victor Castillo sat on the porch, a warm blanket draped over his shoulders. Palomo grazed quietly nearby, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. Inside, the faint clatter of dishes signaled that Marco and Eliza were tidying up after dinner. For the first time in what felt like years, Victor felt at peace. Marco stepped out onto the porch, 2 steaming mugs of tea in hand. He handed one to his father before settling into the chair beside him. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Marco said softly. Victor nodded, his tired eyes scanning the horizon. "It feels unreal, like I'm dreaming. In any moment I'll wake up back in that small room in Austin." Marco smiled faintly. "You're not dreaming, Dad. This is real. This is home." The 2 men sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the steam from their tea curling into the cool evening air. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice fragile but clear. "Marco, I owe you an apology." Marco frowned, turning to face his father. "Apology? For what, Dad?" Victor's voice trembled slightly. "For thinking I was a burden. For believing, even for a moment, that you and Eliza would be better off without me. I let guilt cloud my judgment. I let my fears speak louder than the love I know you have for me." Marco set his mug down on the porch railing and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Dad, you're not a burden. You've never been a burden. You're the reason we are who we are. You and Mom gave me everything: love, guidance, a home. And when we lost that home, we knew we had to give it back to you." Victor's eyes glistened as he absorbed his son's words. The weight of guilt that had been pressing on his chest for so long seemed to lift. Bit by bit, Eliza stepped out onto the porch, carrying a small wooden box. She approached Victor and placed it gently in his lap. "We found this while we were going through what was left after the fire," she said softly. "It's Rose's journal. It survived. Somehow." Victor's breath hitched as he stared at the box. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid and pulled out the journal. The leather cover was singed at the edges, but the pages inside were mostly intact. He opened it carefully, and Rose's elegant handwriting greeted him. Words of love, reflections on their life together, small notes about Marco as a child. It was all there, preserved against impossible odds. Victor read a passage aloud, his voice breaking with emotion. "Victor, if you're reading this, know that love doesn't fade with time or distance. It endures. It's in the walls of this home, in the laughter of our son, in every sunset we shared. You are never alone." Tears spilled down Victor's cheeks as he clutched the journal to his chest. Marco reached out and placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his own eyes glistening. "Mom's words still guide us, Dad," Marco said softly. "And they always will." The three of them sat together on the porch as the stars began to emerge in the night sky. The weight of loss and grief had not disappeared entirely, but it had softened, replaced by the gentle warmth of love and remembrance. Victor leaned back in his chair, his hands still resting on Rose's journal. For so long, he had believed himself to be a burden, a shadow of his former self. But here, under the starlit sky, surrounded by the love of his family and the echoes of Rose's words, he understood the truth. He was not a burden. He was cherished, valued, and deeply loved. The night stretched on, filled with quiet gratitude. The occasional sound of Palomo's gentle grazing, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. For Victor, this wasn't just a return to a house, it was a return to a home, to love, and to a life worth living. Victor Castillo stood on the porch of his rebuilt home, the faint creak of the wooden boards beneath his feet grounding him in the present. The night sky stretched endlessly above him, dotted with stars that shimmered like distant lanterns. A cool breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and faint traces of wood varnish from the house. Palomo grazed quietly in the paddock nearby, his gentle movements blending into the stillness of the night. The faint light from the porch lamp cast long shadows across the yard, and Victor felt a deep sense of calm settle over him. He placed his hands on the porch railing, his fingers grazing the smooth paint. Every inch of this place carried a memory of Rose's laughter, Marco's childhood games, and countless evenings spent watching sunsets with his family. Somehow, despite everything the fire had taken, love had brought it all back. Marco stepped out from the house, a soft smile on his face. He joined his father at the railing, leaning against it as he gazed out at the stars. "Can't sleep?" Marco asked quietly. Victor shook his head, his eyes fixed on the sky. No, but it's not because of worry this time. It's because I feel full. Whole. Marco nodded. Understanding etched across his face. It's been a long journey, Dad. But we're here. And we're not going anywhere. Victor turned to face his son, his eyes glistening in the dim light. I almost let my fears take me away from all of this. Marco. From you. From Eliza. From this home. I wrote you a letter, an apology, one I'm glad I never had to give you. Marco's brow furrowed. A letter? Victor smiled faintly. I tore it up. Son, I don't need it anymore. The two men stood in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging gently between them. Then Marco placed a hand on his father's shoulder. Mom would be proud of you. Dad. Proud of how you've held on. How you've found your way back. Victor looked up at the stars once more. She's still here. Marco. In every corner of this house. In every breeze that passes through the trees. I can feel her. As the night deepened and the stars seemed to glow brighter, Victor felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. True. Unwavering peace. This wasn't just a house rebuilt from ashes. It was a testament to love, resilience, and family. And in that moment, under the vast expanse of the starlit sky, Victor knew one undeniable truth. He was home. And he was exactly where he was meant to be.
What are your thoughts on the son's decision? Was it the right choice to help his foster father return to a home filled with cherished memories? And if you were in the son's shoes, would you have done the same? Share your perspective in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.